What's up, Surfer Squad? Tanner here, and I'm back with another Paludarium build. In this one, I'm finally going to set up the display for my African Bullfrog, Samson. It's not at all necessary to keep these types of frogs in a setup this elaborate, or with this prominent of a water feature, but if you have the means to do so, then it's definitely a viable option. Now then, let's get into the build. For this one, I'm going to use a 40-gallon breeder. Unlike some of the other paludariums I've made thus far, this setup will have a dedicated land area. To partition off this area, I'm going to repurpose an old 10-gallon tank. It was all scratched up and not worth setting up again as a display tank, so it was dismantled. Once I had a few pieces laid out on my table, I scraped off all of the old silicone with a razor scraper and wiped them clean with some rubbing alcohol. Sure, I could have went out and bought glass or got scraps from somewhere else, but I'm actually trying to get rid of a lot of my older, smaller aquariums, and repurposing them for stuff like this is the best option. After all of that, I made some measurements and marked for them with a China marker. Then I scored the glass along these marks with a glass cutter. From there, the glass could be snapped along the edge of a table. As is, the edges are pretty sharp, so they needed sanded down with some sandpaper. Lastly, I cleaned the freshly cut panes of glass with rubbing alcohol to get them nice and clean. The same process was repeated in the 40 gallon so that the new panes could be attached. The pieces of glass were placed in the aquarium and secured with masking tape. I flipped the aquarium on its side and marked along the edges of the glass with a China marker. The tape and glass were then removed so I could apply a bead of silicone along the guide I just made. Once I applied a bead of silicone, the glass was placed into it, and I smoothed out the excess silicone with my finger. Then I added the other piece of glass and taped everything in place. This was all left to sit for 24 hours, and then the tape was removed. Then I went around with the razor scraper and cleaned up the excess silicone. From there, I got a piece of egg crate light diffuser and cut out a few strips with wire cutters. These will be used to more evenly distribute the weight of the stones I'll use to create the shoreline. To do so, I'm using some Red Creek jasper, which is more commonly referred to as freak rock. I set these out in a preliminary scape to get a feel for the material. Once I had a better idea of what I wanted to do, I added a few pieces of polystyrene insulation to create more height without adding more stones. In doing so, I added the stones and more foam as needed. During this process, I also added a few net pots for plants later on. From there, I worked in several segments of mupani wood to complement the initial scape. I wanted these to look almost like roots growing through on an eroded bank. Now we're just about ready to add the expanding foam. Before doing so, I filled all of the net pots with paper towels so they wouldn't get filled with foam. And here's the finalized scape. I don't know about you, but I can see the vision. Maybe you'll see it better once everything is attached together with the expanding foam. For this one, I used Great Stuff Pond and Stone expanding foam. As I usually do, I made sure to get in all of the cracks and applied a lot of it so that I can carve it out later on. After letting the foam sit overnight, it was time to carve. Per usual, I used a razor scraper to meticulously carve it out. I know that carving it is a lot of work, but it's worth the trouble to ensure you get exactly what you want. It also allows the silicone to adhere better because of the textured surface. After carving the foam, I went and covered it with silicone and some garnet sand. I did this a portion at a time by applying the silicone, evening it out, and then covering it with the sand. I made sure to press the sand down so that it would actually get embedded into the silicone rather than just sitting on the surface. From there, I let everything sit for 24 hours to cure. Then it was time to add some detail work. What I did was paint some silicone on the top portion of the structure and covered it with cocoa fiber. I did this to make the transition into the land area more gradual and to add more texture. I let all of it sit for a few hours and used a shop vac to remove any excess. Now we'll move on to the background. To start, I have a piece of pre-cut cocoa fiber liner, which I covered completely with silicone on the back side. This is important so that there's enough tack to hold the fiber onto the tank while the silicone cures and to hold the fiber long term. I applied a little bit at a time and evened it out with a paint scraper as seen here. From there, the liner was carefully pressed onto the back of the tank. As is, this is a pretty boring and flat background, so let's add the details. What I did was add a few pieces of mupani wood and prop them up with insulation foam. After that, I built up some sections of the background with expanding foam. Like before, I let the foam sit overnight to cure. Then it was carved to shape, covered in silicone, and topped off with some cocoa fiber. From there, it was time to make the false bottom. I had to be mindful of the fact that African bullfrogs burrow, so I had to make the false bottom out of something that Samson wouldn't get scuffed on. Rather than make the typical egg crate false bottom or something that he could dig up, I made a segment out of metalamat. This is a really easy solution because you don't need to use a barrier to keep the substrate out. Anyways, after getting it cut to size with the utility blade, the metalamat was placed in the bottom of the land area. Then I mixed up the substrate. For this one, I'm doing something a little different. I simply mixed up cocoa fiber, orchid bark, and sphagnum moss. Although it likely wouldn't cause any issues, on the chance that Samson ingests the substrate, I didn't want him eating sand or charcoal. Plus, the plant load in the land area will be pretty minimal, so those elements aren't as important for this setup. Once the batch was all mixed up, it was added a handful at a time. Although it might not look like it from the video, this cavity holds a good bit of substrate, which will give Samson a nice area to dig in. From there, I added the substrate into the water area as well. What I'm using here is some thoroughly cleaned garnet sand, which is the same stuff I used to create the embankment. I think it was a great choice for this setup because it has hints of red and a lot of dark colors that complement the rest of the setup. After the sand, I also added a few handfuls of sea chem fluorite dark to make more texture. Now we can bring the setup to life with some plants. I can't plant this setup too heavily, so I need to choose plants that will make a big impact and can take a beating. First up is a bird's nest fern. This one is pretty sturdy and can be planted within the hardscape using some sphagnum moss. I personally think this one really adds to the setup, and because of the way it grows, I don't think it will take up too much space. Next up is a variegated spider plant. These grow really well as a marginal plant, so it should do perfectly in the back corner of the water area. I simply planted it in a net cup and used gravel as the substrate. Onto another bulletproof plant, the golden pothos. This one will fill in the space, can take a beating, and will help keep this setup clean. I added segments of this to the left and right sides of the land area. Next up is some Acorus gramineus of Borozuki. I'm using this one to add some additional texture and to go along with that bank look that I was talking about earlier. After getting those plants situated, I added the filter. I won't mention much about it other than I'm using a ZoomEd Turtle Clean 511 canister filter. This is the same one I've been using on MJ's setup and I really like how it's been working out. Plus, since it's outside of the tank, it makes servicing pretty easy without disrupting the frogs. Then I filled up the tank with some dechlorinated tap water and turned on the filter. Given the nature of the setup, it only makes sense to add leaf litter. I added them to the land area for the cleanup crew and for aesthetics. As for the water feature, it was added for tannins and so that debris in the water feature makes sense. What I mean is that Samson will track substrate into the water feature when he goes in. With the addition of botanicals, it will look like the debris is meant to be there alongside them. To finalize the design, I added a few patches of Java moss along the edge of the bank. I also pinned up some Ficus pumila on the background using stainless steel wires. As you would expect, we can't call it quits until we've added the cleanup crew. First things first, we'll add some springtails. These guys will help address any mold and will help break down waste. We'll also add some common isopods and skirted isopods. These will do the brunt of the work when it comes to cleaning up after Samson. There you have it, the African Bullfrog Paludarium. I really like how this turned out, and it seems like Samson really enjoys it as well. There's virtually no acclimation whatsoever. He went into the setup and started acting totally normal. I even heard him croaking on a few occasions. I couldn't capture it on film though because he was camera shy. In case you're wondering, he kinda sounds like a cow. He also gave us quite the show and demonstrated what it means to be an ambush predator. I don't know about you, but I think he looks absolutely perfect in this setup. In my opinion, it really does complement him well. I'm so glad to have finally completed this project, and I hope that it was well worth the wait. Let me know what you think about the finished product down in the comments. Also, be sure to support the channel by giving this video a thumbs up if you liked it. On that, I'll see you all in the next one, Serpent.